Hi, I'm Bill Bronchick, and welcome to Webinar Wednesdays, where every Wednesday around this time, I'm going to share with you some knowledge on real estate investing, legal topics, business topics related to that, and hopefully share a few nuggets that you can get inside of 45 minutes or so. We'll do a presentation for about a half hour, then take some Q&A. There should be a Q&A ability there. If you're watching on YouTube, you can comment right there. I don't know if you can comment live on Facebook, or at least you can comment, but I can't see the comments until after it's over, and I'd be happy to answer them when it's done. If you're watching the replay, of course, you can ask questions or email me, bill@bronchick.com. My last name is spelled right there. You should have no problem finding my email, bill@bronchick.com. So today we're going to be talking about buying houses subject to the existing mortgage. Buying houses subject to. Now, some of you may have some knowledge on this. Some of you may have heard about it but don't know too much about it. Some of you may have even done it a few times or more, but could use probably some clarification or some tips on how you deal with particular aspects of buying property subject to. Now, I'm going to discuss this in the realm of single family, but you can do this with multifamily, you can do this with commercial, you can do this with all kinds of properties. It's not just limited to your single family residential, although for the purposes of this discussion, we'll be talking about buying a house subject to that you could turn around and, let's say, rent out or rent to own out, or put it under contract and wholesale it to another landlord who's going to rent it out. So basically, real estate, they said, is all about location, location, location. We've had that drilled into our heads from the beginning of time about real estate. But in these days, real estate is not just about location. It's about financing, financing, financing. Location and everything else doesn't really matter if you can't get the funds to buy the properties. And leverage really is the key to wealth in real estate. I know a lot of financial gurus will tell you, don't borrow money. Debt is evil. Debt is bad. You want to pay off mortgages as fast as you can. And I'm not going to disagree with that or agree with that, but I want to take an unemotional look at that from a numbers standpoint. So let's say you bought a property for $100,000 cash, and ignoring closing costs, realtors fees, just to keep the math simple. So you buy a house for $100,000 cash, and then a year later you sell it for $110,000 and make a $10,000 net profit. That's 10% return on your money over 1 year. Now let's say instead of that, you took your $100,000 and you bought 4 houses with $25,000 down, 4 properties, 25% down, 75% loan, and for the purposes of our discussion, subject to a $75,000 loan. And then after 1 year, you sold those properties for $110,000 each, which would be $440,000, and yield you a $40,000 profit. And on your $100,000 investment, you would yield 40%. Why the difference? Very simple. The one word, leverage. By leveraging properties, you will do better in terms of your return on your investment. Now, of course, leverage does come with risk. You're going to have payments you're going to have to make on these mortgages, but you get to rent them out in the meantime and collect income, which will hopefully, at the very minimum, cover the payment and expenses and maybe even make you a few bucks. But just assuming that it broke even for a year and you were able to sell each property for $10,000 more, you're getting a 40% versus a 10% return. Now, when real estate values are appreciating, as they are now in most cities, and we can debate whether or not that's going to continue, but over the long run, 15, 20 years, they definitely will, even if we take a dip or two in the meantime. So you want to go wide. You want to get as many properties as you can, especially if you're younger, and then ride the appreciation in a leveraged way rather than just having a goal of buying 10 properties and then rushing to pay them off. Now, that may be your goal, and I'm not going to say it's wrong, but don't do that from an emotional standpoint. Do it from a numbers standpoint. If you can earn greater than the rate of interest you're paying for the debt somewhere else, then it doesn't make sense to rush to pay it off. I know with people's primary residence, that's like the big deal, right? Pay off your mortgage. And if you take an unemotional look at that, logistically, you're writing probably 8 to 10 checks a month on your house, your mortgage, maybe your insurance separately, your property taxes, utility bills, your cable bill, someone who mows your lawn, water, sewer, etc. So not having a mortgage is just one less check a month when you think about it unemotionally. It's not really that much more convenient. It's just a good feeling of having paid off your house. Now, if your interest rate on your house is 8% and you can't earn 8% in the market, then by all means, mathematically, that does make sense. I'm just going to get you to think outside the normal, traditional way of rushing to pay off loans and instead using leverage to buy more houses. So it's sort of the path of least resistance. Path A is you could save your way to $1 million in a 1% CD or a 2% CD. Path B is you borrow $1 million, buy $1 million worth of real estate, and then let your tenants pay it off. Okay? Which is going to get you richer. And I'm not even talking about tax benefits. I'm not even talking about income from the properties. I'm not even talking about appreciation. If you simply wanted to become a millionaire, buy $1 million worth of real estate with borrowed money and then focus on paying it off, or not. Just make sure at least it breaks even, and maybe over 10 or 20 years, it'll double or triple in value. Plus pay down on the mortgage and give you some equity that way. Subject 2 is what we're going to be talking about, doing the leverage using OPM. What is OPM? Well, if you're watching this video live or recorded, you probably think it means other people's money. It actually means other people's mortgages. Other people's mortgages. So buying a property subject to means, number one, the seller is going to transfer ownership of the property to you. Okay? And how are they going to do that? Well, with a deed. Now, what kind of deed? It depends what state you're in, but in most states, it's a warranty deed. Some states like California, it's a grant deed. Northeast, they use bargain and sale with covenants deeds, whatever. Which you're transferring title or ownership from seller to buyer, you being the buyer. Now, typically in a closing, you're going to pay off the seller's mortgage before the seller transfers title. In this case, we're not going to pay off that mortgage. We're going to keep the mortgage in place and continue to make payments. Now, you're not going to assume the loan either. Assuming the loan means calling up the lender that the seller has and asking for express permission to be on the loan and take the seller off. Now, I don't know why you'd want to do that as a buyer, because now you just put yourself on the hook. Now, there are benefits to an assumption that apply as well to a subject to, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But if you can buy the property without assuming the loan and the seller is okay with that, then you're much better buying subject to than assuming the existing loan. Number 4, you continue making the payments every month. Now, if the seller's behind in payments, which is often the case of a subject to, you're going to have to cure those back payments and then continue making them forward. And if the seller was behind in payments and facing a foreclosure, boy, what you've done is a miracle for them. You're saving them from the credit devastation of a foreclosure, a possible deficiency judgment, and improving their credit by making something that's an installment obligation in default to being current and making it current going forward. Now, remember, the seller remains liable for the note. We got to make this very, very clear to the seller, both orally and multiple times in writing. This is still the seller's obligation. You're paying it, but the seller is still primarily liable on that note. And you are not liable on that note, meaning the bank cannot come after you for late payments on your credit. They can't come after you for a deficiency. Even if they foreclose the property, you have no personal liability for that. Seller does, though. Seller remains liable for the note, so his credit will be affected for your non-payment. It'll also be affected if you don't make payments and the property's foreclosed. So we got to make this very clear. explaining the risks to the seller when we do the transaction. And you're probably thinking, what kind of knucklehead seller would actually do this? Well, think about it in a divorce situation. It happens all the time. Husband and wife on the property, husband and wife on the mortgage, or maybe just husband on the mortgage, and pursuant to a divorce decree, husband deeds the property over to wife, moves out with an agreement of some kind that the wife is going to make the payments for a certain number of years and then refinance. Well, that's very risky for the husband. He's no longer on title. If the ex-wife doesn't make payments, it affects his credit. And if the property is foreclosed, he could be liable for what's called a deficiency. In most states, a bank can go after you if the sale amount is less than the amount that is owed on the mortgage. So this is not very uncommon at all in that context. In an investment context, if you have a seller who's got very little equity, but he has a very good low interest rate loan, and that's what we're looking for, maybe 3 or 4%. Low payments, lower than what rent would be for that property. Even if there's no equity or even negative equity, does it really matter? If the payment is $1,200 PITI and market rent is $1,600, is it worth you giving the seller a few grand to take his property subject to and rent it out for positive cash flow? Absolutely. Eventually, the property will go up in value. The mortgage will be paid down, and the bank is not going to want this property back with no equity on it. And it's going to make it almost impossible for the seller to sell to someone else, because if he, let's say, owes $220 on a property worth $200, how is he going to sell that property without coming to closing with $20,000 plus the real estate commission to the real estate broker? So this is a good solution for a lot of sellers. Let's break down a mortgage so you understand exactly what it is that we're doing here. A lot of people are under the idea that they go to the bank to get a mortgage. That's not true. You go to the bank to get a loan. You go to a mortgage company to get a loan. And you sign what's called a debt instrument, which is called a promissory note or note. Now, if that's all you sign, that's uncollateralized. That's just a personal note, similar to like a credit card or personal loan or signature loan. What you do is you sign a security instrument, which in some states is called a mortgage and in some states is called a deed of trust. Now, a deed of trust is a security instrument. It's not the same thing as the warranty deed or title to the property that gets transferred that we talked about earlier. A deed of trust is a lien. It is placed against the property in the county records, and the borrower owns the property. The bank has a debt instrument and as collateral, a lien against the property in the form of a mortgage or deed of trust. Some people are under the mistaken belief that the bank owns the property and they get ownership after they pay it off. That's not true. The borrower has the deed to the property. The lender has a lien against that property. And if the note, the underlying instrument, is in default, then the security instrument gives the lender the right to foreclose the property under a mortgage or under a deed of trust. So visually, it looks kind of like this for you visual people. We've got three parties here. We've got the owner, okay, who's the borrower here, seller in our case. He's got deed ownership title to the property recorded in his name down at the county. He signed a note to a lender. That's a debt instrument. He also signed a mortgage or deed of trust, which the lender records against the property as a lien. Okay, so if the payments are not made on the note, the lender can foreclose. What else can the lender do? Well, the lender could just forego foreclosing and just sue the borrower directly on the note, which is not uncommon in commercial situations where you've got a very wealthy borrower and a really bad deal that's upside down in equity. The bank sometimes just sues the borrower directly and just forgets it. Or the lender, when they bid at the foreclosure, can do what's called an underbid if they think that the amount owed is more than the property's worth, they'll bid the property value, and which will result in a deficiency, which they can go after the borrower for individually. Some states prohibit that on principal residences, but not on rental properties. So when we take subject to, we're just going to take the borrower out of the picture, or seller, and he's going to transfer the title by deed, a warranty deed or similar, of ownership to you, the investor. Now, the lien still exists on the property. The lender is still secured here. If you go down, check at the county, there's still a mortgage lien, but what has changed is ownership of the property. Now, the note is still between borrower and lender. So if you don't pay it as the investor, the lender has recourse against the borrower, and the borrower's credit will be negatively affected. This all has to be disclosed very, very clearly to the borrower. They have to understand what it is that you're doing and what it is that you're not doing. Don't use words like assume. I'm going to assume your mortgage. No, you're not. Assuming means getting permission from the lender. Okay, so that's exactly what a subject to is. You're taking title subject to a mortgage lien, an existing lien on the property. What are some of the advantages of doing this? Number one, no qualification or credit. Now, if you go to assume the mortgage, you're going to have to qualify, which means credit report, W-2s, tax returns, etc. When you're taking subject to, you're not asking the bank for permission, so there's no qualification or credit check. It also won't appear on your credit report from here on in. Plus, you're not going to take it personally unless you're going to live in it, which is one way to buy a house. One of my first houses I bought that way, subject to, and just put it in my name. But you probably take it in an LLC or a land trust. Number two, no liability. You did not sign the note to the bank, ergo you are not liable if things go bad. Now, let me just say as a matter of practice, if you take a property subject to, particularly if it's in default, and you collect rents, and you keep that money and don't pay the mortgage, you could be guilty of what's called equity skimming, equity stripping, or equity skimming. And in most states, that is a felony. Like if you take a property in default, subject to, collect rents, and don't pay the mortgage or taxes, you could be guilty of equity stripping or equity skimming. You're taking money in and not paying the liability. Now, every state's a little different. In most states, if it wasn't in default, then it's not equity skimming. Or if it's after a certain number of years, let's say 2 years, and then things went bad, and for some reason you collected payments and didn't make the mortgage payments, I would say is the right thing to do. The right thing to do, if you took subject to a property mortgage and you are unable for whatever reason to pay those payments, call the seller up and give him back the property. Deed it back to him. That's the right thing to do, because the seller has no recourse. The seller has no lien against that property, no claim to the ownership, but still has liability for the mortgage. So what I would recommend you do is you call up the seller, or first maybe call up the bank with a power of attorney from the seller, and try to work something out in terms of the payment plan. But don't just do nothing, collect the payments and not pay the guy's mortgage. You're screwing up his credit and potentially exposing him to liability. It's not on your credit report, which is a good one. Save your credit for the deals you really need. You could take advantage of loan pay down. I'm doing a closing on a subject to for a client where the loan was originated in 1998, 22 years ago. 22 years ago. There's only 8 years left on the mortgage. So at this point, almost every payment is mostly equity. Not every will be like that, but let's say that the loan was originated 7 years ago. That would give you 23 years left. That's still better than starting at 30 all over again with a new mortgage. You'll also get a lower interest rate if you're taking subject to a seller's loan where the seller was living in the property, because a principal residence loan is going to be lower in interest rate than you would get as an investor buying an investment property. You can't get the rates that owner occupants get as an investor. And finally, no loan origination costs. If you assume the loan, a lot of times you'll avoid that. Sometimes they charge a fee, but not nearly the fees that they would charge on a new loan. So the thousands and thousands of dollars you'd normally pay on a loan origination, you can either pocket as profit yourself or offer the seller a higher down payments, more cash to make the deal work, because we don't have a third party taking some of the profit. So lots of advantages to subject to. Buying without qualification, no liability, none on your credit report. You get loan pay down, a lower interest rate. This is great. Now that I told you all the good stuff, you want me to sugarcoat it, or do you want me to tell you the bad stuff too? I'm sure you want me to tell you the bad stuff, because the mortgage contains what's called an acceleration, also known as a due on sale clause. And it reads like this. If you transfer ownership, the lender may, at its option, I highlighted that, call all sums due and payable. What that means is if the seller transfers the property to you subject to without the bank's permission, they may call all sums due and payable. But here's the thing, 3 words, at its option. So it's not due on sale. It's not automatically due. The lender must exercise their option to call it due and payable. And in 99% of cases, they simply don't. If that's the case, those are very good odds, by the way, 99-1. I, as an attorney, as an investor, have closed thousands of these deals over the last 30 years and only seen 2 cases where the lender made a stink. Those are really good odds. Now, there's risks of everything in real estate. There's risks of tenants not paying, tenants file bankruptcy, trashing the place, a meth lab, a hot water heater busting and flooding the place, a roof leak. I mean, there's all kinds of risks in real estate. This is one of them. Not, in my opinion, a big one, but it is one of them. So the question is, would you rather put 20% down, pay origination fees, qualify for a loan, be on the hook for 30 years, or give the seller a few grand, maybe pay a couple of back payments up, take it subject to without liability, without recourse, at a better interest rate, and not liable if things go bad? That's not a trick question. I think most people would take the odds. And it may just be for a short-term situation. So as you may know, most lenders, when they do a refi based on appraised value, say that you have to own it for at least a year before they'll go 80% of appraisal versus 80% of purchase price. So for example, if it's a $100,000 property, and I know in a lot of your markets there's no such thing, but I'm trying to keep the math simple. If it's a $100,000 property and you pay 50 for it, half price, the bank's going to lend you 80% of 50, which is 40, not 80% of 100, which is 80. If you go to refi it, they should give you 80% of 100, but they won't do that unless you've owned it for a year. It's called seasoning. So you might take a property subject to an existing loan just for a year or 2 until you can get that seasoning done and then refinance and pay off the seller's mortgage. So it might be a temporary solution. Maybe you'll take subject to, fix it up, and sell it for cash, pay off the loan. And the risk of a lender calling that due, or even finding out for that matter, is pretty slim to none. So the risk in that case is almost nothing. Now, if 99% of the time banks don't call the loan due, they don't exercise their option to do so, then why do they even have it in there? Well, for those of you who were around in the late 70s, early 80s, remember interest rates were residential 14%, commercial 20% or more. And if there was an existing loan at 5 and that person transferred it to a buyer and the market rate, let's say for a residential loan, was 14, the bank, of course, wants to exercise their option to force you to pay off that loan because they're losing money at 5% when market is 14. Interest rates have been relatively flat for the last 20 or so years, give or take anywhere between the threes and the fours, high fours for owner occupied, and the fours and high fives for investors. So if you took subject to a 4% loan and market interest rates were 3.75, why would the bank care? And the answer is they don't. So now you know the benefits, you know the risks, you know the options that you can do and the options the lender can do. It's a pretty good strategy. It's a pretty darn good strategy. Now, there's no due on sale jail. I wish I had a dime for every real estate agent, attorney, or title company that told me this was illegal. And no one's ever cited me any law, any statute, any court case anywhere that says taking a property subject to an existing mortgage is a crime. It is a contract. The mortgage is a contract between the seller and the lender. First of all, if anyone breached that contract, it was not you, the buyer, it was the seller who did. Because of that breach, the lender, the other party to the mortgage contract, has a right, if they choose to accelerate the loan, if they choose to. And in most cases, they don't. So there's no criminal act. It's just taking a property that could be in violation of a contract between the seller and his lender. Okay? Now, if you get caught and the bank asks you flat out, did you take it subject to? Don't lie, because that could be a potential crime. If you lie and say, no, I didn't, then what you're doing is potentially, if it's a federally insured bank or a federally insured loan, you are getting them to extend credit based upon a representation, or in this case, a misrepresentation. So just say nothing. Just say nothing. Just do it. Don't call up the bank and ask for permission, because the answer is going to be no. Just do it. And if you get caught, don't lie. I'll give you an example. I had a client who took a property subject to. About 4 years later, the seller calls him up and says, hey, it's still in my credit report. I thought you were going to pay this off. So my client, the buyer, said, no, I'm not paying it off. And the seller didn't like that answer, so he called up his bank and said, hey, this is what happened, and they refused to pay off my loan. The bank spit out a standard form letter to my client saying, you took the property subject to, we're exercising our right to accelerate the loan, you have 30 days to pay it off. So he comes to me and says, what do I do? I said, first of all, stupid, you don't treat customers like that. Even though legally you're right, you didn't have to pay it off. Maybe you could have worked something out with the guy. Maybe give him some more money. Maybe promise him in 2 years you'll refi, whatever. But here we are. So your options are this. You could sell the property and pay it off. You could refinance the property and pay it off. So he says, well, I can't do that in 30 days. I said, yeah, that's kind of tough. So let me ask the bank for more time. So I wrote a letter. Dear bank, we got your letter accelerating the loan. You're correct, but 30 days is an unreasonable period of time to pay it off. We'd like 6 months, please. Didn't hear anything back. Several weeks went by. I told my client, do what you got to do. He sold the property. He paid off the loan. About 6 months later, I get a letter back from the lender. You know what the answer was? No. Took them 6 months to say no. And that's all we wanted. So that's what we're dealing with here for the most part with the due on sale and lenders and so forth. Let me give you some case studies. This is Byron, who lives in Colorado, as you can tell by the snow picture. Had this fourplex under contract, subject to, put it under contract where he's going to take over payments. It was behind a little bit in payments as well. It was in foreclosure. The ARV was $350, purchase price of $240, which was subject to a $225 loan, and he promised $15 cash to the seller. Okay. Byron assigned his contract to me. that's BB, Bill Bronchick, for 15 grand in his pocket, who paid a total of 255 for a 350 property. So I gave, at closing, the seller some cash, Byron some cash, and got a property almost 100 grand below market. Two people made money here. Byron made money on the wholesale. I made equity and profitability, many times over with this property that I just rented out as a fourplex. So as you can see, from a wholesaling perspective, you can open up your pool of potential sellers multiple times, and your potential buyers. Like I could have fixed and sold it, but I fixed and rented it, where I really didn't do much fix them. I just kept it and rented. So that's a lot more people you can wholesale to. This is Bill Tingle, who's one of my students from a long time ago, and now you may know him. He's an author, trainer, and a very bright guy. Actually does some training on Subject 2 now. And this is an old letter he wrote me. He says, because of your training, I was able to leave my job just 14 months after investing. This is one particular deal where the seller stopped me due to a magnetic sign on my truck. How many of you out there are doing that? If you're not, you ought to think about it. This is just a creative way to get sellers to call. He had a magnetic sign on his truck. So he and his wife had owned this home for 20 years. They agreed to let me take subject to a $90,000 loan with payments of $640 a month. We did about $8,000 in cosmetic repair and sold it for $149,900. So his exit strategy was to fix and resell it. And instead of getting a hard money loan, he just took subject to the existing loan. So excellent example of a subject to short term. This is Joe, Colorado Springs guy. Put this property under contract. The seller owed $275, ARV about $300. There was a tenant in there. Wasn't a great loan. It was an adjustable rate loan. You should know what loan you're taking subject to, by the way. If it's adjustable or fixed, what the rate can go high, the highest if it's a fixed. If it's an adjustable, is there a balloon? You should read the note and find these things out. Not a lot of equity either, but as you can tell from the picture, a pretty nice home. The property needed some minor update work, interior cosmetic work. It was built in the 80s and tenant was just coming out of the property. So Joe called up his contractor and said, will you take a look and give me a bid on fixing it up? So the contractor says, well, what are you going to do with the property? Are you going to fix and resell it? Or are you going to rent it? What kind of update are you looking for? He goes, I'm not sure. He goes, I think I'm going to sell it with owner carry terms. So the contractor says, what does that mean? He goes, well, let someone take over the payments and not qualify for it. And the contractor said, well, shoot, my wife and I will do that. We had a bankruptcy and our credit is shot and for another few years, so we would do that. So Joe signs this deal up, zero down, taking over the seller's payments subject to the existing loan, and then assigned the deal to the contractor for 25 grand. And the contractor just made the payments and lived in the property, did the work himself. Worked out for everybody. Here's another subject to wholesale. John Graham, one of my students here in Colorado, found this property, ARV 175, needed about $5 grand in work. He got a contract to buy subject to a $138,000 loan with zero down, assigned the contract to another investor, another client of mine, and walked away with a $5,000 assignment fee. The investor got it for a total of $143 subject to the existing loan with an ARV of 175 and rented it out. Worked all around. So, you could buy subject to, rent it out, fix it up and sell it, wholesale it to someone else. There's so many ways to buy subject to. Now, I've gone over some of the basics and I'm going to get ready to answer some questions in a few minutes. But a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. While this sounds simple in principle, there's a lot of detail and a lot of I's that have to be dotted and a lot of T's that have to be crossed. So I created a course just on buying properties subject to. Teaches you how to find the deals, how to analyze them, because not all subject twos are good deals. You got to know, what the factors you should be looking at, whether or not it's a good deal. How to negotiate with a seller, which is much easier than you think on a subject to. Most people blow it because they don't know what to say. I'll go through that in my course with you. how to put them under contract, how to do your due diligence, and most importantly, how to close and get paid. It's a measly $297 tax deductible if you're in real estate, but I'm going to give you a code webinar for 25% off if you do it today. Just go to my website at legalwiz.com/store, and you'll see all my course offerings. Scroll down. You'll see my land trust, my buying property subject to course, also my land trust course. Just click on it, and then when you check out, just use the code webinar for a 25% discount today. And an amazingly great course. It's online, course manual, contracts, checklists, disclosures, videos. I have a whole video just on how to fill out the contract because it can be a little tricky and a little daunting if you haven't done it before. But it's my subject to contract with such really good disclosures that it's going to be hard for you if you follow my instruction to get yourself into trouble. So let's do a little Q&A now. And boy, we got a big queue full of questions. Let's start here. Okay. German asks, why did it take so long for the bank to get back to you, Bill? That was the example I used where the client took subject to and gave a letter saying you have 30 days to pay it off, and we asked for 6 months, and it took them 6 months just to respond. The answer is I don't know. I think they're just so inundated with more important things and understaffed, and probably had to put the issue through several different people in charge before they made a decision. I'm just guessing, but it is what it is. Next question, Taylor asks, what's the best way to find subject to leads? Well, there's many different ways I discuss in the course, but one particular way, and by the way, you're not going to see an ad on Craigslist that says, subject to the mortgage, take over my payments. You're not going to find that. Actually, I'll tell you about my first subject to deal. I was living in New York at the time, 1992. A seller had a property with a first and a second, and it was listed with an agent. It was in a pretty good neighborhood. Needed a new roof. That was about it. I got the broker to take a lesser commission because the seller had to pay the commission if I bought it cash. The seller just wanted out from under the payment obligations on these loans, the first and second. So I said, I'll take subject to a first and a second, and I'll pay the realtor's fee. And I negotiated the realtor's fee down from 6% down to, I don't remember what it was. I think it was like $3 or $4 grand. And I was very excited. I got it under contract, and the seller was represented by an attorney, by the way, which is very common in New York. And the attorney commented, man, how did you negotiate this deal? This is a great deal. Not only did you get it below market, the seller's not getting any money, and you negotiated with the realtor. You're taking over the loan subject to. Wow, this is really impressive. And so I'm all excited. I'm jazzed, and I'm advertising it in this time, the newspaper. There was no Craigslist, there was no internet. And I advertised it as here's this property, just take over payments, no bank qualifying, down payment minimum. I don't remember what I put. I think I said 15,000. Okay. So out of that 15, I would pay the realtor fee and then closing costs and pocket the difference. And I got a lot of calls, by the way. I got a lot of calls. And I just couldn't explain it to anybody. I went overboard trying to, explain the risks and the subject to and everything. And I couldn't find a buyer. 45 people I talked to. Not one I could get to bite because I couldn't explain it properly. So again, that's where a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I walked away from the deal, though, by the way. I had $1,000 earnest money, which I lost. And now I would know how to handle it. I know a much better way to do it, which you would learn in my course. But that's just one way to do it, finding properties on the MLS that are listed as short sale, for example, and maybe it's worth $200 and they only owe $210, but the interest rate's 3.25. instead of doing a short sale, do a subject to and just pay the realtor's fee cash. Okay. Let's see. Oh, it's just people saying hi to each other. Okay. ACS, do you have the subject to contract we could use in your course? Absolutely. The subject to contract that I use in my practice of law all the time, and it's on its probably 25th revision, because, you know, contracts, good contracts, come from bad facts, right? So you sign a contract with a seller expecting the best. Something happens that you didn't think of, that comes up that the lawyer for the other party raises or the judge raises, and you go, you know, we should really amend that contract and explain it a little better and deal with that issue. So the more times that you've done deals and used the contract and things go wrong, the better the contract gets. So this is my experience of 30 years doing subject to deals, and it's I can never say the words, you know, foolproof. Of course, an attorney would be a fool to say that, but it's pretty darn tight. And by the way, I also have an addendum version that you can use with your standard realtor contract if you're a realtor, or you just prefer use, you know, when you're a realtor, a lot of times the board makes you use the realtor contract, even if it's for yourself, your own deals. So you would add my addendum onto that and by subject to. Okay. Hey, Bill, who pays the closing costs? Wendell asks, for a subject to property. Good question, Wendell. It really depends. Most of the time it's the buyer. Because if there's very little equity and you're not giving the seller any money or very little money, seller doesn't have the money to pay the closing costs. So as a matter of practice, the buyer ends up paying it. But let's say it's worth 200, they owe 140, and you agree to give them 25 grand subject to a total of 165, which is still a pretty good deal if it needs no work. So the seller getting 25 grand at closing, they have money to either pay for or split closing costs with you. So it really depends on the deal. German asks, what's the best way to approach flat fee brokers for leads? Flat fee brokers, I assume you're talking about the ones that charge a flat like $1,000 instead of 3% of the listing price. I don't think it really matters. I don't think it matters, German. If you're dealing with a flat fee broker who's going to make, let's say, a flat fee of $1,000, they're just listing on the MLS. You'll prepare the purchase contract, or your real estate broker will, and the seller's agent will get their flat $1,000, just like on any other deal. Okay, question. Can I tell the seller that he or she can foreclose on me and take the property back if I don't make the payment? That's a good question. If the seller says, look, if you default, Mr. Investor, I have no recourse. I'm up a creek. I don't own the property anymore. I have to make up the payments, and I can't get the property back because I have no ownership. So you can give the seller a lien against the property. It would be a second if there's a first mortgage, that basically says if the buyer defaults on the first, the seller can foreclose and get it back. You can do that. To be honest with you, not too many sellers have really made us think about this. Rosanna writes, Bill, I signed up for your small apartment investing course. Use Chris Haskins' code. Awesome course. Thank you, Rosanna. Chris Haskins does a webinar weekly on YouTube like this one. I highly recommend it. Okay, would you get title insurance on a subject to deal? Excellent question. So in the situation where it's, let's say, worth 200, the seller owes 190. I'm not giving the seller any money, so I'm paying the closing costs. Now, I'm going to definitely do a title search no matter what. I want to see if there's any other liens. Not be a judgment, a second, an IRS lien. Seller might have a co-owner he's not disclosing. Would I buy a title policy, which could cost me $1,000 or more in that deal? I would say you should. Me, I'm an attorney. I know the risks. I've done so many closings. I know the risk. And what's the worst that could happen? Let's say I buy it, subject to, and I don't get a title policy, and I just rent it out and make $300 a month cash flow for 2 years. Then I find out there's some problem with the title. A contractor lien, an IRS lien that we missed, a bad signature on a previous deed, a bad notary acknowledgement, whatever. What's my loss? What's my loss? My loss is nothing. I didn't put up any money. Okay, so if I got a title, if I paid for a title policy, it cost me $1,000, let's say, and if there was a problem, it would cover it. But if I don't, what's my loss? My loss is what I have into it in this case, which is nothing, and I already made $300 a month for 2 years. So, and it may be a problem that can't be solved now, maybe in the future, or can't be solved at all, but won't jeopardize my strategy. So, for example, if it's worth $200 and the first mortgage is $190, and the IRS slapped the lien on there for $100,000 that we missed somehow in the title search, I don't know how, but we missed it. Is the IRS going to foreclose on that property? Well, heck no. There's no equity. Is that my obligation? No. Do I have to pay it? Well, only if I want to sell the property, I'd have to pay it off or negotiate it down. But if I just keep renting it, what's the problem? Right? What's the problem? Eventually, they might foreclose it. But again, it's a matter of risk and how much money you have into the deal. Sarah asks, what is your recommendation on how to purchase homeowners insurance on a subject to deal? Now, that's an excellent question, Sarah. There's 3 ways a lender is going to catch on that you've taken the property subject to. 1, they check title down at the county. Now, why would they do that? They'd have to have a suspicion. So that's probably not going to happen. 2, they find out because instead of getting a check from the seller, they're getting a check from you. Different name. Probably not going to raise any eyebrows. People pay with different check payors or different companies. And the person collecting the checks at the lender, the servicer, whoever's there servicing that loan is not instructed to tell somebody there's a different payer here. So, and by the way you would do it anyway, as a practical matter, is if the bank has an online payment portal, which almost every bank servicer has, you just go on there, set up an account in the borrower's name, and where it asks, give the routing number and checking account number of a bank, put your LLC, and it just comes out automatically. That's easy. All right. The third way they'd find out is you got to change the insurance, because if the seller has the property insured in his name and he transfers ownership to you or your LLC, that policy is now void. There's no longer an insurable interest the seller has. You don't have coverage as the buyer because you're not a party to that contract. So you can either A, try to amend the existing policy to add you on as the primary insured, which is tricky, or B, just get a second hazard insurance policy, but don't name the lender on that policy. So if the property burns down, the first policy will pay off the lender. Your policy will pay off your equity. Now, it all depends on what insurance is in your area. If you're in Florida, this may not be practical because insurance is very expensive. But just look at the math of it and what your strategy is, how long you intend to hold it for, and how much money you're putting up and whether it's worth buying a second policy. Okay? All right. I think our time's just about up, folks, and thank you for joining. I enjoyed this topic so much, and I enjoyed your participation and great questions. Stop on by to, let's see if I have a slide. Yes, I do. My last slide here. Buying properties subject to. You can get my course there on legalwiz.com/store and look for the buying property subject to course. I think it's S. It's in alphabetical order. So scroll down. I have a lot of courses. Use the code webinar for 25% off today and today only. You'll get the course delivered instantly, electronically, and you can get started doing these deals right away. An amazing investment for less than at $297. It's a steal. At 25% off that, it's an amazing steal. It's an incredible bargain. It's awesome. It's off the charts. All right. Thank you for joining. I appreciate your participation. We'll see you next Wednesday on Webinar Wednesdays Live.